Hey everyone, welcome to Disciples of the Faith podcast, where we interview everyday men and women who have devoted their lives to being a disciple of Jesus Christ. We wanted to document their stories to encourage fellow believers that God is faithfully working through His disciples in their everyday life. We hope and pray this podcast will both encourage and challenge you in your daily walk with the Lord. Now let's get started. Dan Jacobs, welcome to the show. Dan has been a disciple of Jesus Christ for the past 47 years. He has lived in over 6 different countries and speaks 3 different languages. He has helped plant churches both in the U.S. and abroad and has been married to his wonderful wife Ann for the past 31 years. He is the proud father to 6 children and has 2 grandchildren. So before we dive into the main interview, I always like to ask a fun question to kick us off.
Sure.
So, what's your favorite place you've ever traveled to and why?
Favorite place? Wow, ever traveled to? Oh man, there are many. One of my favorite places, more in recent years, was Amsterdam. We loved it. It's beautiful. It's just the people are all very tall, so I didn't feel very tall, but it's beautiful. And while we were there, my wife organized this bike ride trip, and we rode all over the place and on bikes, and so we saw a lot of the countryside, and I loved it. It really reminded me a lot of Oklahoma in that lots of farmlands and big open fields and green, pastures and farm, and just lots of cattle as well. So yeah, that was just been to so many places, but that was one of my favorites. Back when we were in Southeast Asia, I think one of my favorite places was the highlands of Malaysia.
Okay.
It was beautiful. It was way up high. Drove through a lot of tea growing, whatever you call fields and things like that, where they grow tea up on the high country, and it was beautiful up there. We stayed in a place that OMF had and took walks and saw all kinds of wildlife, and it was pretty cool. Yeah. Never been to a place like that, way up high in the mountains,
Yeah. What's the wildlife over there
Well,
compared
there's
to
just
here?
lots of birds, lots of lizards,
Okay.
geckos.
Yeah.
We don't have geckos here, but geckos walk up and down the walls. They on the ceilings. They're like big lizards, and they eat bugs, and they make sounds. And our kids used to love watching them. And some of them were really colorful, and that was fun with kids. So yeah, fun time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's jump into it. What was it like growing up at your house as a kid?
Great question. I had a wonderful upbringing. My childhood was just such a happy childhood. My parents were both followers of Christ, and I had 4 siblings, and our house was located right near a river wilderness area, and in Northern California, and it was beautiful. And so I spent a lot of time rather out just exploring, hiking, hunting with a bow and arrow with my brother,
What'd y'all hunt?
Oh, just rabbits,
Yeah.
squirrels maybe, things like that. And but I have to say, we weren't as much hunters as we were chasers. We didn't get much, but we had a blast. We had so many adventures out there,
Yeah.
playing in the waterways there, tubing and all, and lots of fun memories. My dad was a wonderful dad, but he was a bit of a workaholic and just he was gone a lot, gone all day, gone in the evenings a lot.
What'd he do for work?
My dad was a pastor, and so he just had meetings in the evenings or visits he was making, and he was just gone a lot. I was never bitter or anything. It's all I knew, So it wasn't until I got older, junior high, high school, and then later in college, I realized, yeah, there was a lot I missed out on. My mother had carried things in our family for years, and thankfully my mother was she passed away about a month ago, and she was trying to think the words that describe her: creative, organized, fun loving. And so she just made life fun around our house and planned vacations and events for us as a family, and we did a lot. One night, though, I remember my dad was just gone a lot, and my mom had waited up for him. And when he came in, she just said to him, "Honey, our kids are growing up fast. They don't know you, and you don't know them, and soon it's going to be too late. And I don't think you realize that. It's almost too late." And whew, my dad tells a story of how it just hit him. About a week later, he decided to take off work and go to a conference with his best friend. And he came back, and when he came back, he called all the family together around the kitchen table. I remember it like it was yesterday. He gathered us all around, and he started to talk, got choked up, tears in his eyes, and he said, "I need to ask you to forgive me for not giving you the love that you deserve, and that I ought to be giving you as a dad," spelled Time, And he said, "And by God's grace, I'm going to make a change." And he did. He did. He started showing up for everything. He was there as a family. He started being home for dinner most nights. He'd take us fishing and hunting and camping, and we have some funny hunting things. He wasn't really a hunter, and so we almost got arrested because we hunted in the wrong place. But he went to all of our sporting events, and I remember looking out. I remember going along in a school bus to a sporting event and looking out, and there was my dad driving in his car behind the bus, the windshield wipers going in the rain. Sometimes he'd be the only dad there, but he was committed to be there, and it changed our whole family. It completely changed the dynamics of our family and changed our lives. My older brother was already getting into some bad stuff, and it turned him around, turned my life around. Well, part of it was I knew my dad loved me so much, and even though I wasn't a believer, it was hard for me to do the stuff I was doing before because I knew it'd break his heart. And I didn't want to do that because I knew he loved me so much. But yeah, it just changed our whole family forever. So I'm thankful to my mom that she had the courage to just speak the truth in love. Thankful to the Lord that he just reached down and changed my dad. It changed our whole family.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So with him being a pastor and like your mom being a good Christian woman too, did y'all have any routines growing up that you guys did as a family, like Bible studies or anything?
Yeah, Dad sometimes he started doing devotionals in the mornings, where he would read a passage and we'd talk for a minute and he'd pray. I have to say, with 5 kids, sometimes those didn't go so well. It was kind of, okay, someone be quiet. Someone pass the, Dad, I'm hungry. It was just what the best parts really were the events and activities that my mom would plan, and we would have great talks, walking on a trail or standing by a side of a river throwing a line in to catch, and we would just have these great talks. And those were, especially for boys, boys, you don't want to sit and just color. You got to be doing something. And alongside that were these great conversations that we had with our parents. And my mom, she taught us all, music, how to read music, play the piano, and then play some instrument. So later on, she kind of helped us all form a little band, and we began to play at churches and camps and all kinds of stuff. And it was good because she taught us to think about others before yourself. A lot of times we would go to places where no one else would go, maybe some church way in the mountains or a camp that couldn't get people because it was so remote or whatever. And we would go, and she just would always just say, "Hey, it's about pointing them to Jesus. If we don't tell them, who's going to, Yeah. My mom, came from a very non-Christian family. And so she wanted young people, youth in particular, she wanted them to hear about Jesus. It changed her life. She was the first Christian in her whole family,
Wow.
and started a whole new family tree, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So she taught us that, and she knew how to keep us humble, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even though we'd be on a stage and we'd be playing and maybe be, you know, at a big camp, hundreds of people, she knew how to just remind us that we're not the show here, you know. It's really the Lord, and
Yeah.
that was really healthy. So
Good. How do you think the way your parents raised you helped affect the person you became?
well, one for sure, just the whole thing of realizing that, you know, in every story, we're not the hero. The hero is Jesus, that he would love us the way we are and love us enough to change us, you know, that he loved these people enough to send us to them, you know, that he's really the hero. That was really good. My mom was also very organized, and she was an organizer. And we used to joke around by saying, you know, you've heard that God loves you and has a plan for your life. Well, my mother does too. So, but she was just, she taught us to make the most of life, make the most of every day, make the most of a year, to think about the things that will really matter and do those things, you know. She was very intentional. Like I said, creative, fun-loving too. So it wasn't a drudgery, you know. I mean, she even put us up to pranks, you know, that we did on my sister and on my brother, things like that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was just, it was just great. It was a happy home life. And after the turnaround in my dad's life, my dad began to meet with some of my brothers and I in the mornings for school and help us to learn more about Christ and how to read and study the Bible, and what does prayer look like, things like that, that were priceless, you know. And so we had we'd have spirit when we were going through something, a struggle. Even later in my life, my dad was the one I went to because I knew he had time for me and he was a good listener. He didn't try to just give answers. He really listened and to understand. And so,
What age were you guys when he started doing that?
we were ninth grade.
Ninth grade?
Yeah. Yeah. And which is, you know, really, it's like the beginning of, in my day, it was junior high, ninth grade, but it was the beginning of high school kind of thing. And you're trying to figure out who you are as a young man, young woman. And he just, he would ask questions. He was a really good coaching parent in that regard. And I think I learned a lot of that from him. So yeah. A really great, happy childhood, you know. And as a youth, my mom, when we didn't have a youth pastor at our church, she took on the youth stuff and started planning activities, and it was always a blast and always meaningful. So, yeah.
What was y'all's church life like growing up?
Well, like I said, my dad was a pastor. When I was little, my mom used to either sing in the choir or play a piano or organ or something like that. So sometimes that didn't work out so well because that left us free to get into trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. One time, my twin brother and I, we decided, I think we could crawl all the way from the back of the church to the front and no one would notice, you know, which, of course, you know, if kids are crawling through underneath your feet, you know, you're going to notice. You just didn't think about that. We got in some bad trouble for that one.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it was also, yeah, it was, you know, we were at church a lot, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday nights, just a lot. So that was a lot. Sometimes we feel like we grew up at church, but on the other hand, we grew up hearing what the Bible had to say about life a lot. It wasn't like, you know, like this friend of mine says, no one makes disciples for 2 hours once a week on Thursdays. You know, that's not what Jesus did. And I remembered that for years. Nobody makes disciples for 2 hours once a week on Thursdays. It's a life. You got to be there to answer questions about struggles and about questions they have about the Bible or things issues in life they're facing. And that's discipling. And that's really what my mom and dad did. You know, they spent a lot of time with us and listened. And through the years, we're always available to, sometimes my dad didn't even counsel. He would ask questions to help us think it through. And I'd be frustrated because I'm like, Dad, just tell me what to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He goes, well, I'll pray for you. That's a tough one, you know. So,
It's a
but
good
it was,
one. I'll have to remember that
it
one.
was good. In church, one of the things that happened when I was in high school, I wasn't even saved yet, but my dad was already meeting with my brother who had come to Christ. And I just saw in the church, I just saw a lot of young people, a lot of, in particular, guys, sons, whose dads were just too busy. And they weren't spiritual leaders in their homes anyway. And so these guys were just wandering off the path. And I didn't see a lot of men being spiritual leaders, and so that really gave me this heart, not just for youth, for young people for a while, but also just to be a mentor for young men, to help them say, here's what being a follower of Jesus looks like. Here's what being a man looks like. And I know today that's even more so. So many young men who want mentors, but their guys are too busy, you know, or they're not there for them. And so seeing my dad's example, God just early on gave me a real passion for spending time with young men and trying to be a real mentor that would listen and be invested in their lives, spend time with them, do things together, share life experiences, more than just, going through a discipleship book or something like that, but really life on life. And so that was very, very influential. And that's really part of how God used my dad to help me to find a real purpose in life. And my life purpose has always been is to invest in young men to become spiritual leaders as husbands, fathers, and in their communities and church. And so, and also from the time I was young as a believer, I didn't come to faith till I was 17, but early on, I read the Great Commission and figured, okay, followers of Jesus make disciples of all nations. So I want to do that,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like my friend says, I don't share the gospel and make disciples because I'm a worker overseas or because I'm in ministry. I do it because I'm a Christian. That's why I make disciples and invest in young men, because I'm a Christian, because it's what Jesus did,
Mm-hmm.
He took this band of young guys who were just a bunch of knuckleheads, and he invested in them, and their whole lives got turned around, and so I thought that's what I want to do, So anyway, yeah.
So you got saved at 17. Just kind of walk us through like that time in your life. And
Well, my younger brother had come to Christ a couple years before, and I'd seen him radically change. He didn't want to go parties with me. He didn't want to, it's funny. My uncle was a mess, and he offered me a beer when I think I was 8 or 9, and I thought it was disgusting. So I never was tempted to drink and all that, but I would go to parties and walk around with a beer in my hand and pour it in the plants, as I was walking around. Because, just so it looked like I was drinking it, but part of that too, in my high school years, I saw these guys and I thought, these guys would go to these parties and they start drinking and they start acting stupid, and people weren't acting like themselves, and I thought, this is weird. Anyway, and I watched my brother and a huge change in his life. So every year we'd go on vacation to visit family, grandparents and cousins. And so we were on this trip, and that year my brother we were driving through the night because we wanted to go backpacking before we went and saw my grandparents, my great uncle and aunt in particular. They were really probably more like grandparents to us. They were believers. Anyway, and on a highway, my twin brother, he fell asleep at the wheel in the middle of the night, and started swerving and slid, and the tires hit an embankment and the car just flipped 3 times, ended up upside down, and if there had not been a trucker behind us that saw the lights fly, going in the air, we, probably no one would know we were down there, in this ravine. And so they called ambulance and sheriff and all that to come out, and they found us, and we were all alive. It was crazy. That's a whole nother story, but how that God did that. But we're all alive, banged up, bruises, cuts, some broken bones, things like that, but we're all alive. And I knew a couple days later, I knew that if I had died, that because of my own rebellion, wanting to live my own life, I saw great examples of people following Jesus, but I wanted to live my life. I wanted to live for myself. I loved my sports. I wanted to be some big football hero, and it was all about me. I started being interested in girls, and things like that. I was just a really selfish young man, prideful, and I knew, though, if I died, I would have been cast off forever, and rightly so. So after we were in the hospital for a few days, and after we went on to see my great uncle, and the day before we got there, he had a stroke and was in the hospital and couldn't speak, and which was rough because I loved him, and like I said, he was really more of a grandfather to me, and it was hard that he, he'd had a stroke, he couldn't speak, but he had some other issues because of the stroke too, and I was like, and he's late, way up in years, and I was standing in the back, my family was all around him, and he just called me up, with his hand, took my hand and was holding on to my hand and started tearing up. He motioned with his hands, just said, put his finger on my heart, just said, give your heart to Jesus. And, he just said, just stop, stop running. And tore me up. We left that day, and the next day he died. And at his funeral, everyone was standing up, singing in the front, and I was standing in the back. And I just knew I didn't want to run anymore. So I gave my heart to Christ, and everything changed. It was crazy. Everything changed. My desires changed. I mean, I still had some sin issues I had to work through. I was angry and had a temper and all kinds of stuff, but it was just, God was just changing me. A friend of mine started meeting with me, and I met with my dad also, but just learning what it means to follow Jesus, and it just changed. My brother and I started praying together before football practices and before games, and we just started reaching out to our friends. Our friends started asking us, they would come to us and say, hey, they knew we were followers of Jesus because we talked about it, and they'd come and ask us to pray for them or pray for their dad or pray for this. And yeah, it was just so crazy, wonderful. Just changed my whole life. Instead of, my goal was to get a football scholarship, and I walked away from that and ended up going to Bible college,
Nice.
Yeah. So it just, the Lord just turned my life upside down, changed it, and for good. I was really at peace and happy. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about college. Where'd you go? Were you involved in ministry while you were there?
I went to a Baptist college in California Baptist University, and I enjoyed it. And my brother was there with me, and most of my years there were really great. My brother was my roommate, and we had a good time together. I had some good professors, and We had a great church that we went to. We got involved in the youth and the church, and the pastor there just invited me and some of my friends. We started meeting together at a Winchell's Donut once a week just to talk, and it was really great. Those were great years. We were growing a lot, learning how to study the Bible. I had a professor that taught me, basic hermeneutics and how to interpret the Bible correctly, based on context and grammar and all those kind of things. And so the more I got into it, the more I loved it. I thought, man, I really love this stuff.
Yeah.
And I love studying the Bible and learning, and love hearing the stories and seeing that, wow, the thing that amazed me is just, it was God, how loving and patient and powerful, and how involved he was and is in the lives of men and women. And I loved it. Had a great college years, first few years, a great friend group that all love the Lord, and that was really super. My senior year was tough though. My brother and I both became RAs, resident assistants, and we were separated and put in different dorms, and I was given the dorm for the athletes, which at that time during the school, athletes were, well, a lot of them were reprobates, like I used to be. And it was rough. Being an RA there, I was constantly kicking girls out of the rooms and dealing with drug issues and drinking and all that. And I just felt like I was a policeman. And it was hard. I was separated from that group in some ways because of responsibilities. I was separated from my brother. Saw a lot of bad stuff, and honestly, it was during that time also I had become a little proud. Well, not a little. I become more prideful and spiritually. Mm-hmm. I was growing. I was memorizing scripture. I was doing a lot of stuff, and so God just began to. I say this. It's not that God stopped caring about me, but he allowed me to just begin to falter and struggle. And looking back, it was really a gracious thing he did, is he was showing me how much I needed him, that I couldn't do this on my own. Mm-hmm. And that left to myself, because it wasn't my parents. My parents didn't teach me this kind of Christianity, but in my own mind, it was like a try harder Christianity, Jesus did his part on the cross. Now it's up to you, and you just got to try harder. And that all sounds great, but it doesn't work. You're not going to do it. Satan's been practicing his gig for thousands of years, and he's good at it. And, just sin was just kicking my rear end. And I at first it was just little. And then after a while, it was like I was living a double life, because I was just eaten up inside with all kinds of world, flesh, and the devil just eating me up inside. And I was just, and it wasn't anyone else's fault. I mean, I was given in to everything, and then living with this grief and guilt and sense of shame, what's wrong with me? God, help me. And really God used that to just begin this process in my life to just show me how desperately I needed him, and that I needed to learn to cling to him. I needed to learn to run to him. And in fact, it was during those years right after college that this friend of mine began to speak into my life. I saw he had a life that was so different. And one night, I was traveling for my work, and he was with me. We were traveling together, and we had become friends through work. And I was out on a curb, just crying my eyes out at night because of just the sin in my life. And I don't even know how he found me, how he knew I was out there. He came out there, and I was praying out loud, and I said, God, I was quoting, I think, Lamentations. If it's not for you, I'd be consumed every day. And you're so, and my heart is wicked. It's wicked from the earliest. And I was just quoting different scriptures about my wickedness. And he just goes, I wish you'd stop that. he interrupted my prayer, and I go, I'm praying. He goes, I know, stop it. He said, God doesn't want to hear you go on as what a mess you are. Fact is, it's worse than you know. He wants you to focus on how wonderful he is and how great his love is and how patient he is and good and kind. You focus on that and it'll change your life. And he couldn't have been more right. From that point, I went through a process of about a year or 2 years where I just began learning about the grace and goodness and kindness and love of God in Christ. And it really just brought me to a whole different place in my walk with Christ and freedom and strength. And that was a huge turnaround. I call it my grace awakening. But that God used it to turn my whole life around in a way that it was like being saved again, really. But it was because I misunderstood the gospel. The gospel is never, God did this, so now try, do your part. It's like Paul writes, he says, in the same way that you were saved, that is by grace alone, you walk by grace. You walk by leaning on him and looking to him and clinging to him and saying, oh Lord, help me day by day. And the more you know him, the more you love him. And if you got a sin issue in your life, it's because you don't know him. You've got to grow to know him, because the more you know him, the more you will love him. The more you love him, the more you trust him. And the more you trust him, the more you obey him. And if you don't obey him, it's because you don't trust him. And that was me. I thought I had believed this old lie that was given to Adam and Eve, in the garden. God's keeping the good stuff from you. The good stuff's out there. And that was just totally wrong. God's trying to preserve me and save me from a heartache and a life that was broken. That's what he's trying to save me from. And his commands are, like Scripture says, his commands are not burdensome. They're life-giving. He's done this like guardrails to keep you from going off the ledge and destroying your life. And so anyway, it was just a wonderful time in my life. I was a youth pastor, and I was learning and growing, and God just brought me back. And then he also just renewed this sense of calling. It was really cool. My grace awakening, not only did God, he brought me back to a place where it's like he reignited this, he rekindled this sense of purpose to invest in young men. And so, yeah, that was really wonderful. God's been so gracious to me. I have to say, Tyler, I feel like the testimony of my life is just the graciousness of God. Yeah.
When did you meet your wife?
Well, we met. I had lived overseas for a while with this organization and working with young people, and I felt like he wanted me to come back to work for the local church, and so I came back to the States, and I heard of this pastor who had done these talks to men. And so I thought, hey, I want to go visit this guy, because my heart was with young men. And he was a pastor of a church, and that church ended up calling me to come be the minister of men and missions at the church. And there, Ann and I met, and it's funny. I was at the church 8 days before I asked her out.
Wow.
I was so smitten.
Yeah.
Had a time at their house where we sit and talked one night, and I was so smitten. In fact, I didn't really want to get in any relationships because I had some heartache overseas, and I had said, Lord, I'm going to go to this church, and I'll work on staff, and I just want to pursue. Help me not, I knew that. I just said, God, I don't want to get involved in any relationships, and then I went to this family, their house, and met Ann. And driving back to my uncle's house that night, I got in my car and I said, Lord, never mind. Because I was just like, I'd never met anyone like her. And we had so much fun and laughed. And so we dated for 3 months, got engaged. 4 months later, we were married.
Wow.
And 9.5 months later, we had a little boy.
Wow, that's
So,
awesome.
Yeah. So she was just, and our first conversation on our first date, we're driving along, I had this Jeep with oversized tires, and it was loud and hot, because the heater was stuck on, and it was summer. So I was talking on the way to dinner, and I said, "So what do you think about missions?" And which was great because she wanted to go overseas and she wanted to do that. I didn't know that, but that was really pivotal for her.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the little small miracles. Why did I ask that question on our first date? I don't know, but it was key because that's what she wanted to hear.
Yeah.
I didn't know it, but so yeah, we met, fell in love, and then after we'd been married 3 years, we headed to Southeast Asia, and
Wow.
had 2 little ones. And
How old were they when y'all decided to go?
our son was 2, and our daughter was 8 months.
Wow.
And we went and jumped in, and it was a wonderful adventure, and loved what we got to do and be involved in, and got to see God work and do some really wonderful things. And I have to say, I kind of thought, okay, my wife and I, we're from this neat families and this, and we'll go and try to be a blessing, and we got there and we saw Christians and met believers there that were far more courageous and full of faith and bold than we'd ever been in our whole life. And so we got there and just felt like, wow, God, this is to teach us about what courageous faith looks like. So we felt like we learned a lot, and yeah, it was great.
Can you kind of walk us through just like, how do you guys even get to that decision to, we're going to pick up our young family and move across the world? Like, just walk us through.
Yeah, well, we had talked about that from the time we started dating, and we knew, in my own mind, I kind of thought, because I was jumping into this ministry career, investing in young men in a church and missions in a church and all that, I thought it'd be later, we'd raise our family and maybe then we'd go overseas. But God had a different plan, and I went on a trip to Southeast Asia with kind of an exploratory trip. And while I was there, met these guys who, man, they had been put in prison, they had been beaten, they had all kinds of stuff. They left everything to follow Christ and to share the gospel with others. And it just, I had never seen anything like it. And in fact, we were sitting on top of a hotel one night when we were in Southeast Asia, and we could hear, bombs and explosions in the distance. There was still some fighting going on the border, and I thought, Anne's never going to go for this, to come to a place like this, not with our kids, so forget that one, this isn't the place, We came home, and she said, how was it? And I really had a sense that I really think God wants us to go there. But I didn't say anything to her that, because I just thought, man, God's going to have to work in her heart too. And so I think like some months later, church, we hosted a missions conference, and there was a guy who came and spoke, and he spoke about, and I remember he made a statement. He said, when God speaks, it's the time to listen and obey. When God speaks is the time to obey, not when you find, when you get around to it. Whenever God speaks, that's the time to obey. And I was like, oh, wow. Because I always thought, man, maybe we do in 20 years. God's speaking now. What do I do with that? And he also, just the Lord used it to speak to Anne as well. And she came and said, hon, I think the Lord's speaking to us and that he wants us to go. And I was like, whew, well, this is what I'm thinking too. What do you think about this? And she was like, we have to. We got to do this. I said, well, what about the kids? And what about, God will give us grace. He'll show us what to do. She had probably more faith than I did. And I was like, okay. And the country we went to, I didn't even know where it would located before we actually went.
Yeah.
On that trip, I went on a trip, but before that, I never even known where it was.
Yeah.
And so we went there and we worked as part of an NGO, and they had all kinds of projects, and they were very real. We did all kinds of projects of medical clinics and water wells and teaching English and all kinds of different things that we did. And but the process, it was just saying, Lord, the first step for us was just, Lord, we want to be wherever you want us to be, and we're going to trust you with our family. And so, and that was the big step. And, we just saw God, everything we put forward, said, okay, Lord, what do we do about this? What do we do about that? What about this issue? And God just answered everything. And so we knew he was paving the way. He was opening the doors and making it happen. And so in our families, well, at first, my family wasn't real excited. Like when I told my mom and dad, we're sitting at some place having catfish and just muffins and stuff, and we were sitting there, said, hey, Mom and Dad, we've got some news to share with you, and that we just really feel like God's calling us to go overseas and to name the country in Southeast Asia, and feel like God wants us to go now. And my mom, she just sat there and looked at me, and then she kind of looked down and said, pass the hush puppies. She just ignored it completely, like, yeah. I don't receive it, but yeah. The Lord worked in their lives. In fact, they came to visit us 3 times.
Wow.
Over 8 years. And it was wonderful. They were so supportive and loved us. When we had children, babies, we had to fly to a different country because there wasn't good medical care we were in. And they would come and stay with us for 2 months, help with the kids. And it was really sweet. And so Ann's parents came to visit us as well. It was just, God just paved the way. And when we faced different issues there on the field, it drove us to our knees. We learned to pray. I don't know that either one of us, we both loved the Word of God. We loved to study the Bible, but we're very strong in just prayer. And we learned to pray because everything we were hoping to see happen all was dependent upon God. We had to pray. Mm-hmm. We had to learn to pray. So we learned, that's when we first started going on prayer walks together. And just pouring our hearts out to the Lord and praying about everything. And then God just would guide us as we prayed. It was, we're trying to make it up as we're going along, like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And God just began to lead us and help us, show us the way forward.
What were some goals you had for your young family and kids?
Well, that's a great question. Goals we had, I knew that God brought us together to be together. I knew that if God brought us together, that he brought us, it wasn't one of those deals where, he brought us together so that mom, the mom could take care of the home front and I'd do my thing and she'd do hers. We both sensed that God had called us together to do ministry together in some way. And so, and that he also showed us that our children were going to be our first disciples. That if we didn't disciple our own children, what good would that be if we're, investing in everybody else and our own kids were falling away? So we just decided that, okay, our first priority is going to be our kids and their journey of faith and then outward. And so, of course, we did that. Anne was where we were. There was no school, so Anne had to homeschool, and she loved it, and the kids loved it. In fact, sometimes I would listen to their lessons while I was doing something and go, "What? I never heard that before." I'm like, I was learning too. She was homeschooling me too. But we also got involved in ministry. We found there was an orphanage that was really in bad shape, and the government didn't provide anything for them, and there was like 50, 60 kids. And so we started doing this family outreach there to involve our kids. The guys that I started investing in, Anne would just sit with the wives, and she would have them in her home, and she'd visit them in their home. And we just figured out ways where God led us to figure out ways that we would invest in those couples together, me with the men and her and with the girls. And she was good at it. And as we learned, as time went on, I realized, wow, she's really gifted in this, and she loved it. And so there were times where I would watch the kids so that Anne could go out to a village, or so that she could meet with these girls or young women. And it was like we just tag teamed together. And so anyway, one of the things was we wanted to invest in our kids and include them in ministry, but also one of the things we wanted for our family was that we wanted to do life and ministry together. And so tried to figure out ways to do that. Another thing that Anne came up with was she, from early on, and I don't know where she learned this from somebody, about family traditions. So she started creating these traditions that we would do as a family. We had traditions for birthdays, we had traditions for Christmas, we had traditions for coming of age when they were old, when they got into their teen years, and we'd have this big banquet, for them they'd invite friends and mentors and kind of affirm their rite of passage as becoming an adult. But we also had great traditions around meal times, for example. She said, our tradition is going to be meal times in the evening together. And even when we were overseas, I knew, okay, I'm going to make this visit, but I need to get home because we got this, we'll have dinner by 6 or 7. And Anne would have a question she'd ask, and we'd have conversations at the table and involve the kids. Sometimes we'd do something we call high-low. And we'd say, tell us the high point of your day, what was the low point of your day? And we'd go around the table. And so the kids learned to listen and learn to converse. And when we had guests come to visit or whatever, we would just do the same traditions. And so they'd join in. So Anne, she just came up with a lot of traditions, a lot of practices. We'd go, one of the traditions would, no matter how far we were from family, because sometimes, I grew up that family vacations were journeys, across the country to visit relatives. And those were fun. Mm-hmm. But she said, no, we're going to have a tradition. Every year we're going to have a week as a family, someplace, just the family. And so we started doing that early on. And those were really great times where I was away from my work. She was away from homeschooling, stop that. And we just had fun 7, 8 days in a row, just whatever, whether it was the beach or in the mountains or at a lake or whatever. And we just had a lot of great family memories. And I'm so glad for that, because I didn't really grow up doing some of that. Yeah, my mom was very creative, and we did a lot of great stuff on vacations, but we hadn't ever had that kind of thing. We had a week just together, just us. And it caused our kids to love each other and enjoy each other. And so, yeah, great traditions. I think she said she had read a book about a mom that did some of that. And Amy would read books on parenting and motherhood. And we read books together on that kind of stuff too. But yeah, so just different traditions and things that we wanted our kids. And so our kids grew up doing a lot together. And of course, living overseas, we had to do a lot of stuff. When we lived in the north of the country we were at, we didn't have anyone there with us. We were the only family there for a while. Then another family joined us. But yeah, so we had to be creative, come up with fun things, and Anne was great about that. So yeah.
What kind of traditions did you do with your kids, like devotional wise, or was it nightly?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I grew up. I mentioned already how that my dad did, a couple Bible verses and a prayer in the morning breakfast, and
Mm-hmm.
I never thought those that were that great. I was just
Yeah.
what I saw my folks do is have questions they would ask, and we would get in conversations over a meal, or maybe traveling in the car to go someplace. We'd have conversations, and so we tried to do that kind of thing. Anne would have questions at the dinner table, and they would be not just sometimes they'd be spiritual questions or questions about life or questions about, hey, we went to the orphanage and we saw this. What do you guys think? What do you think? What do they need to hear? What would God want us to say to them? She just had great questions to include the kids to begin to think in those terms. We also decided that one of the things we did is that as the kids got, like were a little bit older, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, we would have, they would call it their Bible time with dad or Bible time with mom. And they got to stay up late that night. When the other kids went to bed, they got to stay up late and have hot chocolate. So it was something they really looked forward to. This is my Bible time. This is my night, So
Yeah.
they'd stay up. And what I did is I would go through 1st and 2nd Samuel, because it's a book with some great stories in it, amazing stories.
Yeah.
And so we would go through that and learn about, bad leaders, good leaders, people who are a mess, people who followed the Lord. And you just talk through those. And so I did that with our different kids, and Amy did that with some of them as well. In particular with our daughter, they did study Ruth and Esther and things like that, and some amazing stories. They'd go with the kids. So we did that kind of thing. It was their nighttime Bible time, and our kids loved it.
Yeah.
It wasn't an every night thing. It was one night a week, but it
Mhm.
would be for a couple of hours, and
Okay.
and they'd love it.
Yeah.
Because it was that special time with mom or dad and hot chocolate and staying up late. For a kid, what's better?
No, yeah.
So yeah, those are the kinds of things. And then we had conversations together about things we did. We'd include them in ministry discussions about some need we saw, like at the orphanage. What do you think we should do? Or, they would say, Dad, they don't even have a bathroom on the property, except for that place behind this building. And it's terrible. And there's scorpions and snakes. And could we do something? And so we would just begin to pray and say, yeah, let's see what God will do. And we'd pray, and as a family. And this is like one cool story. We just prayed and said, Lord, what do we do? They had this kitchen that was built over kind of a swampy area. And there was all kinds of, like I said, snakes and scorpions and rats. And so we said, man, this is awful. We got to do something. They had no bathrooms. So we prayed as a family for a couple of weeks. And then we get this email, and a church in Denver had heard about the work that we were doing and had taken up an offering on a Sunday night and raised $10,000. We didn't even tell them.
Wow.
And sent it to us for that ministry. And we rebuilt the kitchen and put bathrooms in, and there was the city dump was on the orphanage property, which that's because the people there, their word for the orphanage was a word means throwaway children, or orphans rather. And so that it was appropriate in their culture to put the dump there because these are just throwaway kids.
Mm.
So we cleaned out the dump, had tractors come out. We did this stuff and built a playground on top of it, and did all that with this money that this church had sent.
Wow.
So, and the kids were involved in it, so it was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you think the goals you guys set out to achieve as a family came to pan out, and why or why not?
Yes and no. Yes, in that for a while in our parenting, for some reason, we got in our mind that the aim of parenting was kids that behave, you know? I mean, but as parents, you hate it when you see the kid at the grocery store who's freaking out and yelling, screaming, and you're like, I'm glad it's not me, you know?
Yeah.
And you kind of think that's the aim of parenting. And Anne read a book at one point, and she read this book by Tim Keller called The Prodigal God. And he talks about how that both the rebel and the rule keeper were both lost in the story. That the younger son and the older son in the story, and people overlook, they notice that the rebel son was lost, but they don't realize that the older son was just as lost because he was prideful, into himself. He was a rule keeper, but he thought he deserved everything. He was ungrateful and had no compassion. And anyway, that changed our parenting, and we began to realize that, you know, both the rebels in our family and the rule keepers are lost. And the best thing we can do for them is to help them to see their need, help them to see their own sinfulness, not in some, you know, preachy way or condemning, but just what's needed in a child's life is their heart to be changed, not just the outward behavior. Mm-hmm. And so we would try to ask questions and so forth that would get to the heart, not just the outward. You know, we had kids who were rule keepers and they kept the rules and it seemed like they were, but the truth was inside, they lacked compassion. They were, you know, thought they were better than other kids. They were sometimes more lost than the rebels who were getting in a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. And so we just changed our parenting, and there are some really good books. One of them's called Shepherding a Child's Heart. And we changed how we parented. So yes, some of the goals we set we were able to see. Some of them, we had to make course corrections when our kids were later, like in high school, because we realized we had some really awful rule keepers who were lost, but they didn't realize they were lost because they had such good behavior in public. But so we had to change the way we did things, and then we also, as parenting, we learned to pray. You know, prayer is probably the most important thing that we came to realize. Prayer is probably the most important thing you can do as a parent, because you can't change your own child's heart. God has to do that, and it's prayer, just seeking Him and crying out to Him and pleading and saying, God, help us, open our eyes, show us, bring other people into their life to speak truths, you know, because sometimes it's not that we weren't saying the right things, but they needed someone else to say it. Mm-hmm. And so we just pray for that. So yeah, it was, you know, I'm thankful at this point, all of our children have grown up to follow Christ and love Him and follow Him. But there were some heartbreaking seasons. You know, I don't know if you noticed, but there are no perfect families in the Bible. Mm-mm. None, not even one. Even the story of the prodigal son. I mean, Adam and Eve in the garden, there are no perfect ones. And I think that's because in life, there are no such thing as perfect families. The family you think's perfect, well, they got some stuff going on you can't see. Yeah. And just know it, you know, that because all of our hearts tend to run toward self and sin. And so that's been comforting to know that God doesn't want us to raise perfect kids. That'd be terrible, you know. Yeah. He wants us to raise children who see their need for a Savior and see their need to run to Him. And that's a good thing. So.
Yeah, definitely. Tell us a little bit about each of your children and just, you know, kind of just the ages when they came to know the Lord.
Our oldest, he came to Christ when he was young, but he would say he had some major, really, turnarounds later in his life when he was a young man. God helped him to see his own need and his sinfulness. He was one of those that was kind of the rule keeper, but God just helped him to see later in life his need, and yeah, he's really smart. He loves engineering and all kinds of stuff like that, and so he's also he loves the nations. Most of our kids have at one point have considered maybe going overseas. We've told them, hey, we just want you to do whatever God made you for. That's the most spiritual thing you can do with your life, is to do whatever God created you to do. Mm-hmm. You do that and do it for Jesus' sake and love people in Jesus' name around you. And you do that and we'll be happy. That's, and that's what, Paul wrote, and he said, I strive to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. That is, I strive to take hold of that purpose, that mission for which God made me for. And like it says in Ephesians 2, it says, he created, we are his workmanship, but he created us for good works that he prepared before we were ever born. He has works that he wants us to do. And so we want our children to figure out what that is and do that. Do it for the glory of God, do it and love people around you and point them to Jesus. And so our oldest son loves engineering. He also loves overseas work. So we'll see. Yeah. Our next one, she really has a lot of compassion, but she also is, she grew up with 5 brothers, so she's pretty tough. Mm-hmm. I mean, she's very tender and gentle, but she's, so she works at a hospital right now, helping people to sort out why they ended up in the place they're at, what kind of changes need to take place in their life, in their diet, in their exercise, in their whatever, to help them avoid this happening in the future. Mm-hmm. And so she is really good at that, and works at a hospital helping people in that regard. Our next son is he was not a rule keeper. Yeah. He was an adventurer all the time. Oh my goodness. He was the one when we were in Southeast Asia. I just said, "Hun, I know the kids here run around naked, but I want our kids to at least have underwear on when they go out. So please make sure they have underwear on." So he'd have his underwear on, but he had a little play pistol, and he found that the fly in his underwear was like a really cool holster, so he'd walk around with that in his underwear outside. That's funny. But he loved outdoors, so he always has loved the outdoors and loved mountaineering and hiking and underwater stuff, everything else. So he pursued his career. He's a special forces in the military, and wow, and he does that really well. And his aim is he's also a medic, and he wants to save people's lives, but his career keeps us praying a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because they get in harm's way, but he loves what he does. And then we have another, one of our kids is a nurse. 2 of them actually becoming nurses, and they love that and are really good at it and love people. And then we have one of our sons is going to become a chaplain in the military, and
that's cool.
He really loves that and is pursuing that now. So they're all, they're doing a lot of different things. Yeah. But they, I think they're, on that path of finding out what God made them for, and that makes us happy. So
that's awesome. Well, walk us through a little bit of your career over the years. I know we've talked about some of it, but
yeah. Well, we married and work in a church and doing men and missions. Then we went overseas, Southeast Asia. We were there for 8 years. Really loved it and learned a lot. Oh, just learned so much. I got involved with this. I got a phone call from my friend one night saying, "Hey, there's this church way out in a village that's being persecuted. Can we go see them?" So we went out there, and the leaders were all black and blue. They looked like they had been almost beaten to death. And they'd shared the gospel with their families, and their families thought that they were bringing some foreign spirits into the village, and and they beat them almost to death. And they said, tell us how Christians in America endure persecution. And I was like, well, Christians in America, and this was some years ago, aren't really persecuted a lot. And they said, oh, because everybody's a Christian? I said, no. They said, well, why? And I said, well, and they said, oh, because everyone loves Christians. I said, no, that's not it either. And they kind of looked at me like, well, why don't Christians face persecution? I mean, when they meant persecution, they meant like they were facing severe. And I said, well, I didn't know what to say at the time. And I said, well, sometimes Christians in America kind of adopt a form of Christianity that avoids persecution. We just try to just be peaceful and comfortable. And they looked at me horrified, and they said, oh, please pray for us that we will never do that. So I ended up meeting with that house church for months, going out there a couple times a week. And anyway, it just changed me in my view of church and what it could be. And at that time, then I really felt the Lord was calling us back to the States to church plant, try to put some of these principles we were learning into practice. We had learned from those people. So we came back to the States. We church planted for 8 years, had wonderful 8 years, but also faced some real opposition and persecution. And that was tough. It was the first time I had experienced it in my own life.
Mm-hmm. Like in what ways?
People who would come to the church and they wanted a church that looked like the church that maybe they grew up in or that they wanted. They didn't want the kind of church we had. Mm-hmm. They wanted a church with all the different programs and had to do this and that, and we didn't have that kind of church. And they wanted the pastor to be a CEO instead of, I just met with men and tried to make disciples, and I was making mistakes for sure, lots of mistakes and all, but it just, they didn't think the church was what it should be, and they didn't think the pastor was doing what he should be, and it was kind of like wolves, and it was rough. I mean, it was pretty hard. And Anne one time was taking a walk, and she said, Lord, is there ever going to be a time when we aren't completely cast on you? And then she caught herself and went, why would I say that? But even that time too, the Lord just continued to teach us to prayer walk and seek Him and listen and try to follow His lead. And anyway, we were there for 8 years, and then we left into a church in another state where my wife's parents lived, and it was really good because her mom, cancer had returned for the third time, and it allowed us to live near them before she passed. So we went to that church, and we were there for some years and really loved it. It was a wonderful church who loved us, loved our kids. We loved them. It was really a great time. But every year when they'd come around and talk about missions and show videos, my wife and I would grab each other's hands and just get all teary-eyed. And we just knew that the Lord was calling us back, Mm-hmm. So we... At that time, the wars were taking place in the Middle East, and there were a lot of displaced peoples escaping war. And we really felt like God was calling us to go back to one of those countries to help and work with displaced people, because we had worked with displaced people in Southeast Asia. And so we started the process of going. And so now we've been there for 7.5 years. And the place we're at now, we love where we are. A lot of wars, a lot of turmoil. It's crazy, but it's also a really wonderful harvest field right now. Because of the wars and the displacement and the instability, it's caused people to be very open to the gospel. Mm-hmm. It's caused people to want to search out the Christianity of the Bible. because the religion they've grown up with is harsh and hard and violent, and there's no peace. And in fact, one of the questions I ask men that live in that part of the world, I'll say, I've lived in many different countries and know different cultures, and everywhere in the world, people want three things. It's the same three things. Everybody wants them more than anything else. They want three things. They want love, loving relationships. They want happiness, joy, and they want peace in their lives personally, in their families, whatever. So how has Islam brought that to you? Love, joy, and peace. And almost always they will just look at me and say, it never has. I said, well, do you know that that's the very things that Jesus promises? And he always keeps his promises. Have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever heard the story of the Bible about Jesus? Do you know what the true story of Jesus is and what his message was? And most of the time, most of the people we see have never heard the gospel. Just pieces of it, or just a twisted version, Mm-hmm. So we've been, we've been doing this for a long time, different countries, but we love where we are now and feel like God's not done with us. Our kids are grown and all, so we're empty nesters, but we feel like he has more work for us, and we want to see these believers grow up and be strong and multiply and be able to stand and operate on their own. And when I say on their own, I mean without Western money.
Yeah.
Without, that it would be indigenous, self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating, self-correcting, like the early church was in different places. Yes, they still need people to speak into it, like Paul writing letters, making second trips and so forth, but they can function on their own without being held up or, propped up. And we're not there yet, so we look forward to going back soon.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
I know talking to you at breakfast the other day, I feel like you had a very different view of Islam than what you hear. Just tell us a little bit about what you've seen Islam and the people there.
Well, Islam is, both the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Judges, and then the Apostle Paul, he writes, and all of these different passages say that there's only one true God. There's only one. And so where do these other religions come from? Well, the scripture says that these other religions, these other false religions, false gods, they are demonic. They're created by men, or in some cases by demons. Demons visiting people, giving them some sort of a vision, something to try to stir this up. And there are religions all over the world that on the outside you think, oh, they're just so sweet or whatever. But the more you get involved in any religion, and I would say this when we're in Southeast Asia and that part of the world, the more you get involved in understanding that religion, the more you begin to understand what's behind it. Like Anne one time was talking to a language teacher, and she said, so she was asking her questions about her faith and as a Muslim, and she said, so it sounds like underneath all of this things you have to do, there's like a river underneath it all of fear. Is that correct? And she sat there and goes, yeah, well, yeah, it's fear. It's fear of being, condemned, fear of being judged, fear of evil spirits, fear of the wrath of your relatives, fear of asking questions, because if you ask questions, then you're seen as you could be condemned forever if you ask questions, if you question something that's being taught. And and it's just fear driven. And people in the West don't understand that the more you get the more you get deeper into any of those religions, the darker it gets.
Mm-hmm.
The more you get into what's taught and what's done, it really is true, the darker it becomes. And in most any religion all over the world, women are treated like property, and often worse than animals, worse than their livestock or their pets. They're treated as slaves. They're treated as simply baby makers. They're treated as sex slaves. They're treated as, and it's only in Christianity that women are raised up and treated as equals and treated as of equal value to God as a daughter and a son. And so, yeah, the more that I have been there, the more I've learned, the darker it's become. And there are peaceful, don't get me wrong, there are very peaceful Muslims who want peace and want, happiness, joy, love, joy, and peace. But you can't be a real good Muslim and want those things.
Yeah.
The deeper you get into it, and it's like in Buddhism or Hinduism and other religions I've been involved in, the deeper you get into it, the darker it becomes. Mm-hmm. Because it's void of a God that loves them and desires for them to know him and have a relationship with him, and desires for them to give them a path of life and joy and peace that's found in a relationship with him. The world wants to say, oh, all the good stuff's out there. It's not in walking with Jesus. But the truth is, no, out there is a bunch of heartache and brokenness and despair, and people end up taking their lives because of the brokenness and the sin. Sin makes people not just stupid, it makes them dark. It makes them intensely selfish. The atrocities of, like, for example, the Nazi regime, those kinds of things are found in religions all over the world. People just don't know it because they haven't gotten into it that deep. Mm-hmm. But the deeper you get into any of those religions, you begin to find out, wow, that is so dark. And I mean, yeah, it's like the religions that the Israelites found when they went into Palestine, into Canaan. It was murder and rape and incest, bestiality, and offering your children, burning them alive, all kinds of stuff. That every religion in the world, the further you get into it, the darker it becomes. It's Christianity, and knowing that a one true God who loves us, who's a Father, who's a Son, who's a Spirit to dwell within us, who changes us from the inside, doesn't just give us a list of rules and say keep them and you can't keep them. Instead, he comes in and changes us and gives us a desire to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. The problem is not the rules. The problem is what's inside. We're all bent on doing the wrong things, on selfishness. And it's like what's happening in America with porn. It's all over the world, and it makes a man into a monster. It causes men just to become intensely selfish and after a while, cruel and worse than animals, And so I found that in different countries where I've been, and it's going and teaching them about the message of the gospel, of a Father God that cares about them, of a Son who's willing to give his life to pay the penalty for their sin, and a Spirit who wants to come and change them from the inside out and give them, love, joy, and peace, and change them. It's like this triune God is just beautiful. It's just, he's wonderful. And so often people have never heard that there is such a God, and that's why we do what we do. I love what we do. I love where we live. I love doing what we do. It's a wonderful adventure, Mm-hmm. So, and right now, here in the States, goodness, there are people everywhere from all over the world who've come to America. You can do this right where you are. every major city in America has people from these different religions who don't know. And so, man, there's opportunities abound everywhere. You just have to say, Lord, show me where to go, show me who to love. And that what I think is the key too is, Lord, how do you want me to love this person in your name for your sake? And then opportunities to share with them abound. You don't try to go, I got to share my spiel. No, I'm going to go and I'm going to love this person in Jesus' name and point them to him, and then opportunities to share my story, to share stories from the Bible and share the gospel. They're just everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Well, let's take a short break and then we'll jump into your 5 greatest stories.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're back from the break. Let's go over your top 5 greatest stories or memories of a gospel conversation.
Well, there are some great, I had to whittle it down. I kept thinking of more that have just been amazing. And most of the time it's amazing because of what God did. And the extent that God would go to, or the path to whatever, to get us to people that he wanted to hear. It's just amazing. One in particular is one of my funniest. I had a friend, and this is in Southeast Asia, and he and I and a group of guys, we met together every week and just doing leadership training for ministry. And he was a pastor of a little house church way out of the city. And he said, asked me if I would go with him to visit his village he grew up in. And I said, where is it? Oh, he said, it's just outside of town, where they live. And I said, okay, great. So it's about 3 hours to his house. And anyway, went out there, and when I got there, and I'm driving this old model Land Cruiser, and I get there, and I brought my oldest son went with me. I would try to bring our kids as much as I could on trips. And so I brought my oldest son, and we're there at the house, and here he comes out, and then his wife comes out carrying a big pot. He's carrying a pot. They have a couple of pots of curry and rice coming out, and then out came his mother and their 2 boys. I thought, okay, we're going to have a full carload, and they put all this curry stuff in the back. It's like a curry soup in the back of the Land Cruiser, and he sat in the front, and Luke sat with some of them, or toward the back. Luke sat in the back with the curry, and we're all filling up the car. And we said, okay, head it on. He goes, okay, just head down this. It's out this road. So we head out this road. Well, he said it's just outside of town. It was 50 kilometers north, which is in miles. It's like 35 miles through the jungle. On an ox cart trail. This trail is not even for cars, and so it took us a long time, and we're going through out there, and as we're going along, you could smell the curry, and as we'd been traveling for, I don't know, maybe an hour or so, and I started smelling something, and I was like, what is that? That really reeks. And I asked a question, and my son Luke piped up and he goes, Dad, the boys, they just peed in the floorboard. I'm like, oh no. And my friend apologized. He goes, yeah, I didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do. And so we just thought, it's, just rubber mats back there. So they just peed in the floorboard. So now we've got curry sloshing around in the back, and pee where that is made for a really great smell.
I can imagine.
And then we're just maybe 20 minutes out from the village, and we get to this river. And we get to a river, and it's a pretty good river, and going over the river is a bamboo bridge. Well, I'm driving a Land Cruiser, which is 4,000 pounds without anybody in it.
Yeah. And
I'm like, there's no way. I mean, you can't use this bridge to go across. This is for ox carts and other stuff like that. I mean, this is bamboo, and that's crazy. And I said, man, I don't think we can do this. And so my friend, he gets out, he goes up on the bridge, on the top of it, and he looks, and he kind of stomps his foot, and he jumps up and down, and then he looks at me and gives me a thumbs up, like, it's going to be okay, you know? And I'm like, oh, you have no idea. 4,000, but he weighs all of 100 pounds. You know, this little guy. It's like, oh. And so he comes back and I said, no, this is way too heavy. And he goes, oh, this is so important. The whole village is waiting for us. They've gathered, they're waiting for us to arrive. And I'm like, which is reason why we're carrying 2 big vats of curry.
Yeah.
It's a big meal. So I'm like, oh my, okay. So I back up a little ways and I thought, okay, the river's not wide. It was only maybe, 20 feet across, 30 feet across. And I thought if I get enough speed, I can hit that bamboo bridge and we can fly over and perhaps it'll carry us and we'll land on the other side. Because I'm figuring the bridge is going to start collapsing, but maybe it won't collapse all the way and we'll make it over. So, because coming back, we could go a different route. And so I backed up and I say, hold on. And we just took off, and I'd forgotten about the curry. But we took off and we hit that bridge, and man, we were moving and we got air on the other side and we made it. The bridge was still standing. So boom, we went over and landed. Curry, now the curry smells even stronger because it's spilling everywhere. So we're almost to this village, and right before we get into the village, there's like a little bush in the middle of this ox cart trail. And what I didn't realize is hidden in the bush is this stump that's been cut off. So we're almost to the village, and I go over, you could see the village right there, and I go over this, what I thought was a bush, and hit this stump. The stump tears out the spare tire from underneath our car, just tears it right off. And as I come into the village, our spare tire passes us. just rolling. I'm like, oh, great. Now we don't have a spare tire. So
nice. We
got the spare tire and got the curry out, put it in the back end. And we got there. The whole village had gathered, and they said, okay, come up. They had a stilt houses. All the houses there are stilt houses. And so we went up into the stilt house, and the elders of the village had all gathered. And I was like, wow, okay. So we go up there, and they wanted to just talk. And so my friend, his idea is, I'm going to share that with them, my testimony of how he had demons. And it was terrible. He was a terror to the village. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the backstory, but he said he was just out of control, and they couldn't control him. And these demons would come, and he would just begin yelling. And it's kind of like the demoniac in the Bible. I mean, they couldn't hold him down. And one day, the local pastor, who I knew from a local house church, prayed. And he said, God, would you give me just 5 minutes with this young man with clear thinking? Just give me 5 minutes with him, and I'm going to share the gospel with him. And so he was walking down the street and saw him, and he said, hey, so-and-so, and he answered. And he goes, oh my goodness, he's thinking, he's coherent. Share the gospel, and he became a follower of Christ. So he shared this whole story with the village leaders, and they were like, wow, that had to be, because they have a lot of struggles with evil spirits and demons there. And then I shared the gospel and drew some diagrams and shared it and all. And when we finished, the elders, the village elders, there's about 10 or 12 of them, they all looked at each other and were shaking their heads. We're speaking in the native tongue. And they just said, we believe this message is from God, and we believe. We want to be followers of Jesus. Wow. And I'm like, all of you? And they were all saying, yes, we all want to become followers. And I was like, even my friend, he was like, oh, wow. He thought we'd just have a big meal and maybe share a few times with individuals. And here we are sharing with all the elders. And so he continued to go back there. He lived closer, but he continued to go back there for months and saw a church start.
Wow.
But that was the coolest deal. Funny part of it was about halfway through my friend's testimony, my son Luke climbs up. He was downstairs. He was with the other kids and stuff. He was only like, I don't know, 5, 6. Mm-hmm. He climbs up there and says, Dad, can I come sit up here with you? I said, okay, what's wrong? And he goes, they keep pulling my pants down. I said, what? And he goes, yeah, they keep pulling my pants down to see if I'm white underneath. They've never seen a white person. So I said, yeah, you can come on up here. So that was fun. And what was really amazing is that God knew all that was going to happen. He knew that we'd have curry sloshed, and he knew that the kids would pee in the floorboard. He knew that we'd lose a tire. He knew all of that. But he knew we could do that. And he brought us there because he loved these people, and that village was ready. Mm-hmm. And they heard the testimony of this boy that had grown up there. And that's what was amazing, that God would do so much to bring it all together so that they could hear about the one true God and see them come to Christ. And that just blew my mind that he would do that, you know. He cares about people that most of the world's forgotten about, you know. It's really cool.
That is so cool.
One time, again, this is in Southeast Asia, my wife and I were driving to a village to make a visit with a family. And we get to it's dirt roads, but we get to this intersection and there's a crowd gathered around, and I stopped the truck and got out, and there's a big crowd, and inside the crowd I look, there's a man laying on the ground. There's a moto, like a small motorcycle kind of moto on the ground, and this guy is bleeding. He's got a head wound and there's blood everywhere, just a pool, and he's gonna die. I mean, there's just so much blood. And a pool of blood that's getting bigger. You can just see it. And we're like, what's going on? Why is he laying there? And they said, oh, he's a thief. And everyone knew he's a thief, and he had stolen this moto, and now he's going to die. And to them, he's getting what he deserves. They're just going to watch him die.
Wow.
And I just like, no. And so we scooped him up off the ground. She opened the back end of the truck. I put him on a mat in the back of the truck, and we just took off back to the city to try to get him to a hospital. And we got to the hospital and pulled up and yelled out to bring, come out to bring him in. And they weren't going to take him unless I paid first. That's just how it works, And so I had to pay him, and they took him in, and they were able to save his life. And then he's at the hospital recuperating, but they had police there watching him the whole time.
Yeah.
And I got to share the gospel with him there at the hospital, and he gave his life to the Lord. And then when he was well enough, they transferred him to a prison. And I don't know if there was ever a trial. They just took him to the prison. And this prison, there's no food, there's no services. It's not like prisons here,
Yeah.
They just have a slab, and if the family doesn't bring food, they'll starve, And
wow.
So I went several times. His family was there bringing food, and I went and met with them and got to continue to talk with him about following Christ. And when he got out, we lost touch with each other. But here's this guy who was a thief. He was going to die. And God, sometimes a miracle is not, I may have said this already, it's not just an event that's miraculous. It's the timing that God put us there at the exact moment after he'd wrecked. The blood was everywhere. If we had been 5 minutes later, he'd died.
Yeah.
To bring him in. And why? This guy's a thief. And they were going to let him die. And God did all this so that he could hear the gospel and his whole life be changed. And again, I'm just amazed that the extents that God will go to bring someone to himself and to give them life. It just blows me away.
Really cool. Yeah, it is baffling that God seeks us out.
He does.
He's the creator of the whole universe.
Yes.
And he actually cares about us.
Yes. He is relentless in pursuing us and even allowing really hard things to happen so that we'll see our need,
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of this next story. So we're in the Middle East, and we working with displaced peoples, refugees, because of wars who flee their country to go into the neighboring countries to get away from war and all the atrocities. Sometimes people here don't understand when there's wars in countries like that, the atrocities will just are horrifying. You think, how can human beings do these to other human beings? I mean, and it's because there is no understanding of the God we know, and the value of human life. And so this we got a phone call from a friend in the city that said, hey, there's a family that is escaped the war, and they're now living in the town where you guys are at. Would you guys go and visit them? We said, yeah, absolutely. So we got a phone number to text them and said, could we? And it was like, I could tell they're really hesitant. They're scared. Yeah. They're scared that the other religious group, because like in Islam, there's 4 or 5 different groups. And if you're on the wrong group, it can be dangerous, And so they were just questioning, who are we and why are we coming? And they were scared. So we went and visited them. Really 3 families were living in this, about the size of this office, and we brought them some food, brought them some blankets, some pillows, pots and pans, things like that. We have kind of, when we visit a new family, we have usually bring things that we know they're going to need if they've just arrived. And so just provide immediate kind of emergency care. And we sat down and they were very grateful, and they fixed us tea and coffee and they want to talk. And from the very beginning, they started asking questions about the Jesus of the Bible, that they had known of some Christians in their country, and they wanted to know more about this. They were tired of their traditional religion, and they were tired of the atrocities and that it promoted and allowed, and they wanted love, joy, and peace. Yeah. And they started asking questions. So we sat there. I think the first night we were there like 4 hours. Wow. Then we came, and then they say, when can you come back? Can you come tomorrow? I was like, no, tomorrow we can't. 2 days, we'll come back. So I think we were there 3 nights a week for 2 weeks. 3 weeks, I think. And they're just asking questions. They asked us for Bibles. Could we give them an Arabic Bible that they could read? So we got them Bibles. And in fact, during that time, they read the whole book of Genesis and read the book of John, and were starting into other Gospels already. They were just consuming it, just taking it in, reading it at night. They'd never heard it before. Yeah. And they had lots of questions about what they were reading. And we were just like, okay, we'll come again in a couple of nights, and we'll talk more. And, we'd leave. The area they were in, wasn't a safe area. We needed to usually get out of there by 9 or 10. Mm-hmm. So we would leave, but we've had visits before where we've been at someone's house till midnight, 1 a.m. and say, we need to leave. And they said, no, don't leave. Sleep on the floor, stay here, Yeah. Anyway, we'd known them a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, I guess. And the kids could not go out and play because of threats from neighbors, because of the sect of Islam that they were part of. And so I thought, man, these kids got to get out. They got to get to a park or something. Let's bring them to the park. There's a playground. Let them run around, And so we said, hey, instead of coming to your house meeting, let's go to the park and the kids can play while we just talk. We walk and, answer questions, things like that. So went to the park, and we're walking along, and I'm walking along with the dad, walking with one of the moms on the other side of the park. And he looks at me and he goes, so he says, so what's next? I said, well, what do you mean, what's next? He goes, well, what do we do now? And I thought, what do you mean, like as refugees? But he goes, no, I mean, we've been learning, we've been reading, and what do we do now? I mean, should we be baptized or what? And I said, well, you mean you believe? You want to follow Jesus? And he goes, well, yes, of course, that's what. And I was like, oh, Well, because in our part of the world, generally, someone you talk to them, you can share, and they'll, yeah. Of course, we had met with them a lot over 3 weeks, probably 10 times, but most of the time, someone you'll have to talk maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 times before they're even at a place to even show, yeah, I want to believe. But they were just so ready, and come to find out, God had been drawing them for years. And anyway, I didn't know it, but on the other side of the park, Anne is walking along with the wife, and she says, "So, do you believe the things we've been telling you and reading, or do you believe what you've read in John and the Gospel?" And she goes, "Well, yes, we believe." She said, "Really?" And she goes, "Oh, with all my heart." And they just hug each other. And then we got together and go, "Oh my goodness." This family and then her brother all decided they wanted to be followers of Jesus. And so our local partner baptized them, and they didn't have a church. And some of the churches, they're persecuted because of where they're from. So we just invited them to a house church along with some other local believers, and began doing house church together. And it's been really beautiful. And they continue to ask questions. Yeah. It's not like anything you might hear. It's not like a song service and then a prayer and an offering and a sermon. It's we get together and they talk about the week and hear ups, highs and lows, and we pray for each other, and then we'll sing some songs, in Arabic, and sometimes we'll use like a YouTube thing. Sometimes just sing. They've even asked us. They've said, "Is it okay?" They've been reading the Psalms. They said, "Can we change the words slightly to make them into a song? We'd like to." My wife, she loves it and she likes poetry, and so she wants to write some Christian songs to the Lord, but out of the Psalms, but just not change the meaning, but just change the words so it would rhyme. And we go, "Well, yes, that's okay." And they're already writing songs,
Yeah.
It's just so cool. It's so inspiring. And what's inspiring is that God, here they are living in the darkness of Islam, and God is drawing them for years in different experiences. Like one of the experiences, he was at war. They were fighting ISIS. And there was a guy in his platoon or whatever who was a Christian. And they were surrounded and they knew they were going to die. And he said, "Let me pray for us." And he was a Christian, and he used the Lord's Prayer and prayed for them and prayed Psalm 23. And this man had never heard that before. And he thought, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And so he just, through the years, God was just planting seeds so that when they finally fled and escaped and came out, they were ready. They were, and again, it's just God going to extraordinary extent to draw this person to himself and to soften their heart and bring them to him, In fact, I got to tell you this. So this guy, he says, we started discipling him and going through just basic discipleship of the Bible and prayer and need for community and different things. Well, we hadn't even gotten to the lesson on sharing your faith yet. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Hey, I want to tell you, I had a phone call with my cousin last night over WhatsApp." And of course in Arabic, but he's saying, I called him up and I said, "Hey, I wanted you to know I've become a follower of Jesus. Our family, we're Christian now." And he goes, "What? Why in the world would you do that? Christian, that's crazy. What are you thinking?" And so he says to his cousin, he says, "Well, it's like this. I feel like I've been in this classroom my whole life where the teacher," talking about God, "the teacher is always angry and he asks me questions I don't know. And when I don't know the answer, he beats me. And if I ask questions, he beats me. And it's never good enough. And no matter what I do, I never know if I really have any hope. It's just a roll of the dice. And everywhere I look, all around me is more anger and more hatred, and it's just everywhere. Well, now I'm in a class where the teacher loves me, talking about Jesus, and he welcomes my questions, and he cares about my life. He doesn't ask me questions I don't know. If I don't have questions, there's someone to answer them. I ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. He welcomes them. And then he helps me to become a better father and a better husband. And we're happy and feel loved. Well, think about it. Why would I ever want to go back to that other class? And I listen to him and I go, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, God just gave that to him.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, what a beautiful way to share. It was awesome. So God just, how he works, just drawing people to himself. And I think sometimes God, Jesus said the Father's always working. God is always working.
Mm-hmm.
He's working all around us. He's working in people's lives, in our workplace, in the neighborhood. And sometimes we just don't think he's working because we can't see he's working. Well, here's the way you find out if he's working is you get out and you ask questions and you love people and share your story. And then you begin to realize, oh my goodness, God's at work here. And you don't know it unless you take the first step. And so we would have never seen that except we went and visit them. And then we begin to see, wow, God, you're already at work.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Yeah, that's really cool.
That is amazing. Shortly
Shortly after Ann and I married, we moved into our first home, and we're newlyweds and new family, new with kids, and we had our son, and I think our daughter was just born, so we'd been there a couple of years because we'd lived in an apartment before. Now we're in our first home, and we thought, okay, we want to get to know our neighbors, and so there was 2 doors down was this young family just like ours, and he worked for an oil company and traveled a bit. They had 2 kids just like us, and so we were at some like block party that was going on, and I said, hey, you want to get together for coffee or lunch sometime? I'd love to get to know you a little more. And he kind of looked at me like, yeah, okay. And so we met up for lunch near kind of halfway between where we worked, and we sat down for lunch. As soon as we ordered, he just leans over the table and he looks at me and he goes, we can be friends, but as long as you don't talk to me about Jesus. I was like, excuse me? He goes, well, I know you work at a church, and we can be friends, but just don't talk to me about Jesus. And I was like, whoa, Lord, where do I go from that, Mm-hmm. And I feel like the Lord just helped me. And I said, well, he's the very center of my life. He's everything. He's changed my life. I was not a really good person. He's turned my life around, given me a wonderful family. And so I'll never push anything on you, but it's going to come out from time to time just because it just does. But I'll never push anything on you. I will never try to preach at you. But it's going to slip out just because he's at my everything. So I hope that's okay. And he goes, okay, I'm good with that. And so we started getting together for coffee. Every once in a while, our families started doing barbecue and things like that. And my wife and his wife Ann and her began to get together for coffee, and the kids get together. And he and I found out we both loved to mountain bike ride. And so we'd get out and ride in the dirt and the hills, and we both loved to fish. And so we just started doing stuff together, and pretty soon he just became a really dear friend. In fact, I'm a brand new dad, and he shared with me some stories of his traveling and things that he was learning about what being a good dad is and making time for his kids. And And honestly, I sat there and learned from him some really great lessons on fatherhood. And anyway, one day we'd had lunch and he brought me back. He had picked me up and brought me back to the church where I was working. And I'm getting ready to get out of the truck. And he goes, hold on. I said, what? And he goes, one more thing. I said, okay. He goes, would you tell me how I can know Jesus like you do? I think I'd like to do that. And I was like, wow. Because I was sharing answer to prayers. I was sharing things that I was learning. I was sharing about things we're doing with our kids. I was just kind of living out loud about as a follower of Jesus, but never preaching to him, never. And so here he was saying, now I'm ready. I want to hear. And so right there, I just shared the gospel, and he prayed and surrendered his life to Christ and began a follower of Jesus.
Wow.
And it was just awesome, God was just showing me how that, because before that time, I always thought sharing the gospel meant I had to do my spiel. And now the Lord was just showing me, just like when Jesus, like the woman at the well, you go, you strike a conversation, you show them love, you show them that you care. Jesus, his conversation, the fact that he would even talk to her, the fact that he would show her value, the fact that he made some statements to her about God's looking for worshipers, as if to say, like you could be one, He's just showing her that she matters, that she's valuable, and it changes her whole life. And so it's like it changed my view of how I share. And now where we are in the Middle East, you just give someone an ear and listen and ask questions and really show them that you care and that you're interested, and all kinds of opportunities open up. And it doesn't have to take weeks. It can be within a few days or, but yeah. Anyway, so that's a story I remember, just a fond story. So
yeah. Last night you said you had one more story you wanted to share. What was that one?
A story about a young man who he was an Uber driver, and I was getting a ride from our apartment to a local gym. We were in the Middle East. And I'd learned enough Arabic to be able to, converse. And we're driving along, and just on our way to the gym. And he says, "So what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'd spent some years with the organization as a counselor." And I said, "Well, I have a counseling background, and but right now I'm just studying language, and perhaps going to work with refugees." And he said, "Counselor?" Well, he said, "I got a friend. And I want to ask you, maybe you can give me some advice." And I said, okay. And so he starts describing this, quote, friend that he had. Mm-hmm. And the more he talked, I could tell he's talking about himself. And the anger that he had for his father. And just, because of the abuse and the violence at home and how his father had treated his mother. And he just hated his father. And so I got to sit there and talk to him about that and just say, friend, the thing you want to be careful about is your anger. If you're angry with your father, you'll become just like him. You realize that you have to get free of the anger, or you'll just follow and you'll become an angry father just like him, and you abuse your kids just like, and your wife and all the rest. And he's like, well, what do I do? And I got the chance to just sit there in this Uber taxi and share with him, just because I was being a listening ear and trying to treat him with value and love. Here he's suffering, and he was agonizing inside. Said if he could, he would kill his father. He was so angry, and then be able to share with him, it was just really beautiful. And again, God just set that up, because he cared about this young man and wanted him to hear. Didn't want him to be caught in this cycle of anger and lostness. And maybe he was going to become like my mother, first Christian in his family, and start a whole new family tree. So it was just really cool. There's so many stories, though. There's some funny ones. You know, there's a guy I shared with, and he was all excited to listen. This is in Southeast Asia. He was so excited to listen. And I was excited, like, wow, someone just wants to hear. And so I shared, I went through the gospel, and he was like, yeah, yeah. And what do I do? How do I believe? And so he goes through this whole thing. And I was doing it all quickly because he was excited. And instead of listening and asking questions, I was just going a little too fast. And I shared the gospel, and he said, okay, yeah, let's pray. And so he prayed, gave his life to the Lord. And then he looks up at me and he says, this is wonderful. Now I have Buddha and Jesus. I was like, oh no. Okay, yeah, I need to slow it down, ask a few questions, make sure I understand what things going on here. There's too much of in a hurry to do my spiel. So there's been some funny flops as well. So
yeah, that's really cool. Well, let's move into this last part. Can you just kind of walk us through what a typical quiet time with the Lord looks like for you?
Oh, a typical one. Well, it's changed over the years. After my Grace Awakening, I would always try to take a little bit more time just to sit before I ever read. I remember hearing someone say that Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says that the scriptures are spiritually discerned. And I thought, well, that means the Spirit has to help you discern it. Because there's a lot of times I read the Bible and I get nothing out of it. You know, just read and okay, looking for something. So I just started praying before I would read. Just say, Lord, would you open my eyes to what I'm going to read, to how much I'm going to read, whatever. And if there's a lesson or a truth you're wanting to speak to me about you, that's the main thing. Lord, what do you want me to show me about you? And then is there something there you want to speak to me about me? And so I started doing that. And then when Ann and I got married, we began to, our philosophy was, hey, God brought us together to be together, not separate. So I asked her one day, I said, would you mind if we kind of read the Bible together? She thought I meant sit, next to each other and read out loud. And I said, no, I don't mean that. I mean, we'd have our own quiet times, but just read and pace what we're reading. Like if we're reading through the New Testament, read it together so that later in the day, we can talk about, hey, you read that 2 chapters this morning. What stuck out to you? Or what did you think when Jesus said this or when that happened? What were you thinking about that? Or do you think there's an application to what we're going through right now? Questions like that. So we started kind of reading through the Bible together, pace on the same pace, and it has been wonderful. We've been doing that for about, 15, 20 years. Wow. And generally we will try to read through the Bible in a year, 14 months, depends on how slow or fast we go. Yeah. And then we'll read the New Testament through slower, but within a year, and then we'll read the whole Bible again. So every 2 years we've read through the Bible once and through the New Testament twice. So anyway, we've done that, and we just read and start out by praying. And usually we'll just read for maybe 20 minutes and take notes of things. A lot of times I'll write question marks in the margin of things I want to look at. Mm-hmm. And, maybe the next day I'll read the same thing. Or if I'm reading like through the Bible, I got to keep going. But I'll look up, maybe if I have questions about something, or look up cross-references and understand a little bit better. And then we'll talk about it different times during the day. And I've loved it because, well, most women think very differently than most men. That's an understatement.
Yeah.
And what that means is they see things differently than what we see, and they gather insights of things that we don't see. And it's been awesome because Ann will just have insights into things I never thought of, and I'll have insights into things she's not thought of, and we'll be able to talk about those. And it's been really great. We both enjoy talking about it. We might be driving in the car and just talking about it. And it's been great in a lot of ways. One, our kids see us talking about spiritual things from the Bible, and I want them to see that. It's not private. It's something it's in front of them. And then second, I learn from what she's learning, and she's learning from what I'm learning. And third, the big thing is, I always wondered, that you're supposed to be a spiritual leader, and how do you do that? And I never could figure out how to do that, because I always felt like my wife was way smarter than me in some ways, and she knew the Bible better than me in some ways. And so this way, and I heard one time that leadership is just initiative. The leader is the person who takes the initiative. And that's what being a leader is. It's just the initiator. You initiate a conversation, and that's being the leader. It doesn't mean you got to be the smartest or have some great insight. I've joked around and said, generally, if I want to be a spiritual leader, I don't say, honey, sit down, I got something to teach you about what I read this morning. And that doesn't never go well.
No, I can imagine.
Sit down, let me instruct you.
Yeah.
But if I say, hey, sweetie, what'd you think about that this morning? How did that strike you? What'd you think about this? She will have thoughts about it, and we'll get to talk about it. And it's often great. And we just learn together. And in that sense, I am learning with her, and I'm leading her spiritually, but I'm not trying to instruct her. I'm just, like a dream she had years ago. We were running a race, and I was ahead, and I was reaching back, grabbing her hand, And it's not that I'm ahead of her. I'm just saying, hey, let's do this together. And so, so we read the Bible together and talk about it throughout the day. And then we'll have our own, we have our own private times of prayer. Each of us use like 3x5 cards where we write requests. I'll have a card for her. I have a card for my kids. I have a card for the men I'm discipling. I have a card for extended family. I have a card for special needs that we're aware of, and she has the same. And we'll pray through our cards, for maybe another 35, 45 minutes. And then at some time, usually in the mornings, because our kids are gone, but when the kids were with us in school, we'd wait till the kids were in school, or maybe in the afternoon when they're taking a break, and we'd go for a walk together. Or in the evening sometimes we'd go for a walk, and on the walks we'd pray together. We'd pray for our kids, we'd pray for just burdens that we have, things happening, things like that. And that's been another thing that's been really great in our spiritual journey, is going for prayer walks together. I love it because it helps me to know what's on her heart. My wife, you want to know what's on her heart? Prayer walk, and you'll find out what's in her heart, because she's going to put it right out there, and it's like I get to be a listening ear of what's going on inside her, and I can better be a good husband, So sometimes we'll stop and say, hey, we want to, let's go through the Gospel of John slowly for the next 6 months, and we'll do that. Or we'll want to, we memorize some scripture and we want to study that, and we'll do that for a couple of weeks, and we'll take a break. And so it varies at different times because of different emphasis, but generally that's the pattern, and we really love it. We love what we do there.
Yeah. It
works for both of us, and I feel like we're growing together.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
It's been awesome.
You bet.
Thank you for joining us as we heard from today's Disciple of the Faith. We hope you were inspired and challenged by the stories shared, and that you feel led to share this episode with someone in your life who could be encouraged by it too. Please like and subscribe to follow along as we introduce you to other Disciples of the Faith.